Hi, I'm Seamless. Today is Tuesday, and this is the making of G Sharp Part 3. This is the mixing and the mastering portion. So the actual interaction between the elements of this song was not a lot of stuff was happening. The big bulk of what the effort in this track was mostly getting the drums to sound the way they do. But we'll get to that. So we kind of touched on this when we're looking at the sound design portion, but this track does sort of not follow the usual setup that I have for a lot of my tracks, in that I do to put the drums in front and the mixer, like the early channels, but since I'm later, I have a sidechain bus and then the subs, kind of whatever. All these things are things that I do that make sense for the EDM stuff, but for metal stuff, not so much. Metal's a much more volatile genre when it comes to trying to force it to be loud, because there's a lot more things happening on each instrument level, and that makes it kind of harder to make it all work together. Fortunately, I didn't have a vocalist on this track, because that would have made it all kinds of difficult. I actually do have a pretty hardcore method of mixing and mastering metal tracks, but I actually didn't do that for this track. I kind of just stuck it to being kind of easy. So, for example, in the guitar track, I have a limiter, and this is sidechaining the snare. So the snare is sidechaining the guitar. This serves a couple of purposes. One, I mean, I don't have to actually, although I kind of did, because right around here is where the snare is. But metal snares are not as well defined in their fundamental tone as like regular snares are. And if we actually look at the snare, it's over here somewhere. It actually looks pretty well defined. That's only because I made it that defined. But there's also a lot more happening on the rest of the spectrum as well. So fitting precisely what's happening onto a tone, like a guitar, is normally what you do. But I didn't push it as hard as I normally would. And I also just I'm sidechaining it, so it's not as big a deal as well. The sidechain itself is also mostly facilitating to exist only for the transient moments. You see it's doing it, and then it's kind of going off a little bit quick. And the purpose of that is to preserve the snappiness of the snare, so it's not competing with as much, and it stays kind of loud. It's not perfectly doing so, because it's still reacting to the attack on the compression side, which is like, it seems like it's not doing a lot, but it's doing a little tiny bit. So that means that it's not doing a perfectly good job. I could have done manual automation to make that even more perfect, but that kind of perfection doesn't really sound the way you'd expect it to with metal stuff. In fact, much like EDM, just in different ways, a lot of things that we come to expect about how things sound come from a lot of things that often people will consider to be mixing and or mastering mistakes just in the past that have just become, now that's what it sounds like, and now we do that on purpose. So I do that on the snare. On the bass, I am sidechaining it directly with the kick. So we're able to do this because the metal kick is very fast and very sharp, which means that I can have a lot of them happening at once, and I can have them sidechaining, and they actually will be individually sidechained, as opposed to if I were doing this with a more EDM-focused kick, which has at least a little bit of a subtail, and it would just be a flat mess of just pushing it down. It wouldn't really be rhythmically sidechained at that point. We probably wouldn't even hear the signal because of how much is happening. And as a kind of a mixing point, you do need to be conscious about the style of kick usage in the song, because you might notice that I leave the double kicking to being filler on particular elements, or like leaning on other things, or not that fast. I'm not doing ISIS level George Coleus stupid fast stuff, because even if, it wouldn't sound good, but even if it did, the mixing in this particular style would be devastating to the track. This sort of really sharp, really punchy kind of kick mixing only really works if the kick is a bit more sparse than you might want. But of course, you just need to mix it differently if you're going to do it really fast, stuff like that. What else? And then the Reese thing has both kick and snare sidechaining. Very sharp, very quick, because again, the purpose of this is not like house style sidechaining, where we're doing this mostly as a rhythmic thing. It's a rhythmic style. We're doing this as a mixing tool, which is to say that the sidechaining really only needs to exist for as long as the source does, so that it doesn't actually sound like it's being sidechained, but the effect of it is usually that the elements that we're sidechaining with, the kick and the snare in this case, actually punch through, because they're literally punching holes in the mix. But they're perfectly sized to fit in what they are, so that the stuff doesn't sound like it's being punched. sometimes. The rest of the stuff, like the cuts that I'm making here, these are partially sound design choices, but they're also partially keeping things in line with how certain things sound. So you might notice, for example, that there's not really a lot of high frequency presence in the guitar tone. I'm even boosting it a little bit. You can kind of hear like a teensy bit of sharpness in there, but if you can just look at it, you can see that there's not a lot of high frequency presence. So when we pair it with something like the Reese sounding thing that does have a lot of high frequency presence, what ends up happening is that we only hear the Reese thing. We just hear the high frequency just sit on top of stuff, and it just sounds like this really tinny, really just not a good time kind of thing. So that means we need to kind of make it not match perfectly with what the guitar is doing. Because if I wanted to do that, I would just send the signal through the cabinet emulation, as we discussed in the previous video, and then that would have just made it sound exactly like the guitar. But I didn't want it to sound exactly like the guitar. I wanted it to sound like its own thing, just with the guitar. But I didn't want it to fit with the guitar and not just be devastatingly, overbearing. So a lot of the mixing was kind of making the guitar and this sound work together. And this is not, like most mixing, there's not a lot of like secret like techniques and measurements and levels and things that I'm paying attention to. I'm mostly just doing it until I think it sounds good. And these are what the results ended up being. Now let's talk about the actual drums. Turn all the drums on. Dirt, 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 dirt. So, for fun, let's actually listen to what this sounds like without any processing whatsoever. All right, so our journey begins at the Superior Drummer plugin. So to get Superior Drummer to do what I'm doing right here, which is that it's putting out all its individual outputs into sequential outputs inside FL Studio, first you must go to the wrapper settings, go to processing, and then auto map outputs, and it'll put them in sequential order. There's usually only 16 outputs, and by usually I think I mean always. And then inside Superior Drummer, go to the mixer side, and then you right-click on this, and you select multi-channel, and it'll automatically arrange this in what it thinks is the best arrangement of outputs to make stuff work together. And for the most part, it's usually pretty right. But I actually did a bit of a change here to the way it's organized. And the way that I did that is I actually made the rack toms and the floor toms, their outputs here, actually be their own outputs, which they usually bust together. They usually bust together, and then and then they come out as being their own output. But the way I wanted to actually mix each individual tom themselves, and so then I did that. And it just meant that I had to make my own numbers, and they come out, and eventually they all sort of came out in their own deal. You can see that they're saying out 1, 2, out 3, 4, that kind of thing. That's left and right. And so that of the 16 outs that we have, that means we have a total of 32 outs, which I've used every single one of. The way that Superior Drummer works, and the reason why I like it a lot, and the reason why most people like it a lot, is that each output is not really instrument-based. It's mic-based. Every sound and sample that we're hearing is processed through an actual mic position on the source recording itself when they set up the drum kit and then recorded itself. And they did actually set up the entire kit when they recorded each individual drum. And the reason for that is because along with the individual mic recording, like say, this kick in. Along with all the individual mics, they also have mic bleed, where they kept them set up. They kept all the mic positions set up where they were, and then whenever you hear an individual hit, you can toggle on to have bleed into every other microphone, where you will hear that same hit bled into that microphone. It's not the sample that's just filtered a bit. It's actually a different recording entirely, which is why Superior Drummer is as hardcore as it is because its whole point is that you're able to treat it like a real acoustic drum recording. You're able to look at this and not say, okay, the kick goes in this channel, the snare goes in that channel. You're saying, okay, the kick mic goes in this channel, the snare mic goes in this channel, tom mics go where we're going. Then we have overheads, and then room microphones, and then ambient microphones, and all these things that you could actually control which instrument is going into that microphone. And I do have a lot of other microphones set up here. I have the overheads. Ambient mics, monos, and then the chamber mic, which is great because it's kind of like real reverb. It's the actual reverb in the room, the real room that the drums were recorded in, and like that kind of thing. I have different instruments that happen to being in different places to get the kind of the overall feel that I want, though. So like in the overheads, for example, I don't have the kick or the snare in the overheads, but I have them in the ambient sections. But I don't have I have the ride in the other ambient section. I have the split in a lot of different microphones, and they were not like super deliberate. It was mostly that I just wanted a very diverse selection of drums. So now we look at the mixer together. We're seeing this as being the kick mics, the snare mics. I mean, there's 4 snare mics. There's snare top and snare bottom, and then dynamic and condensed with different kinds of microphones for each type. Bottom mic, top mic, and then the side chaining. And that's all very nice. So that's as much of the split up as we get before we can before we even do anything. Is that those are the kinds of things that we want to take into consideration, is that sort of stuff. Now let's talk about what I actually did with the actual sounds. So the kick and the snare got compressed pretty heavily. This might actually be one of the Sound Goodizer presets. I think it might be because I don't think I would remember ever doing this. And this is actually a little bit of a funny story. Way back in the day, before I was really good at what I was doing, I would do a lot of metal recordings, and I discovered, especially with particular Superior Drummer kick presets, that if I just stuck the Sound Goodizer on it, it actually sounded kind of awesome. Now, you might be thinking, this isn't the Sound Goodizer, this is Maximus. Well, guess what? Maximus is actually what powers Sound Goodizer. Sound Goodizer is just a group of Maximus presets. That's why it says Sound Goodizer presets here. And I'm pretty sure this is a Sound Goodizer A, because I really don't remember making any of these decisions in terms of its split. Also, I want to point out that there's also more control you have over the individual instruments up here. For example, that decay, if you don't like that, you can actually make it shut off faster. Am I doing this right? That's a cowbell. It's actually already doing it. Yeah. So that's this Maximus, I'm pretty sure, is the Sound Goodizer A preset. Just kind of doing this thing. And then I have an EQ controlling it to be what I want. And this is, again, mostly just sound design decision based, which is to say that I made this kind of sound good by itself. And then I would make minor adjustments about how it behaves with everything else, which is just how all mixing is done. Except for the snare. The snare got kind of hardcore. And I knew I was going to do this going into it. But the way this works is that I compressed it with Maximus, and then this way I separated the bands to represent the individual sort of the parts of the anatomy of a snare. So the low end represents the fundamental tone. You hear it distorting because I have distortion on it, but I'll talk about that in a second. Distortion, quote unquote. So that's there, and then together. And this is all the way that I wanted the fundamental tone to be really snappy and really loud, but not linger, because I could make it linger. Didn't want that to happen. So that's what this curve is for. This would make it linger, and this makes it go away. So that means that it gets up to the peak that I wanted to get at, but then it doesn't, because if you had just turned it up, if I just EQ'd that to be louder, its decay would be the same as it was. You might be thinking, well, I can make the decay shorter with that envelope control that we had in Superior Drummer, and you're right about that, but I wanted the mids and the highs to keep what they're doing. And that's the whole point of multi-band compression, is the idea that we can surgically take care of individual parts of the spectrum and then not screw with the other parts of the spectrum. That's the point of that. Mids and the highs have a similar kind of setup where they're made louder, but then they're being sort of forced to go away a bit faster. The higher frequency has this double curve thing going on, which is referred to as in Ableton's compressor as an up-down compressor, which is to say that the quieter it gets pulled up a bit, but the louder it gets brought down a bit. So it's kind of normalizing in the center of the curve, the higher frequencies. You might notice that the time variables are not particularly snappy, and that's just because it's a snare. It's already kind of snappy. Don't really need to worry about it. But then on the master, I'm also pulling it up a bunch, and I have a slowish time delay because I actually wanted it to decay a bit longer. See how that works? I'm using soft saturation. I'm not limiting it on the top here, so the soft saturation is what's keeping it below 0 dB. But like this is distortion, and the reason why this works is because the thing is so transient and so fast that the frequencies themselves are not super dangerously affected. You might be thinking, well, the low end certainly sounded kind of bad when it was by itself, and that's because that's what it sounded like by itself. It's masked. That kind of behavior is masked by the mids and the highs being on top of that. So that's why we didn't need to worry about it. Also, when I'm doing this kind of compression, I'm not soloing it and listening to it by itself. I'm listening to it all in context. So, and then it's EQ'd. I just did the high pass and the light boost on the fundamental and the higher frequencies. This is basically what a mixing equalizer looks like, which is very light, not super deep controls, versus a sound design EQ, which is just doing whatever the hell you want it to do, because you want it to sound the way you want the sound. So now the other snare is the bottom, and the purpose in real life of a bottom snare is that you have a lot of bleed in a real kit, and this means that especially hi-hat, because the hi-hat is usually right next to the snare, and that's where your snare mic is, and so you get a lot of hi-hat in your snare. So if I were to push the higher frequencies like I did in this snare, what that would translate into is a hell of a lot of hat in your mix. And there's ways you can deal with that, but the primary benefit of having a bottom snare mic is that the bottom snare mic doesn't have a lot of hat bleed, which means that you can push the bottom higher frequencies in there. It's not this guy. You can push the bottom high frequencies, and then that will be a nice replacement for the higher frequencies that were in the top snare, where you can use that to then attenuate the hat mixing. That's the purpose of a bottom snare mic. I don't really need that in this, but I kind of like how it sounded in there, so it's just together. It's super subtle. This is the hat mic, I think. Do I use it ever? Yeah, all right. In real life, I don't ever record the hat on purpose. It's funny. I did the drum recording video I did with the guy Joel actually requested that I put in a hat mic for particular sections where he does a lot of hat work, and I would do that. But in most real life situations, I don't put a hat mic in there because the hat gets in everything. It's just there, and usually the overheads are enough to get the general idea of your hat doing its thing. But the benefit of having a hat mic is that you can have more isolated control over sort of how it blends, which is the situation that ended up being present in the Joel guy's recording. Now the toms, all the individual toms I mixed individually. I don't actually use a lot of them, but yeah, I didn't even use the floor tom. But each of these has a pretty similar setup, but they are tailored to their actual individual instrument, the individual tom itself, because they are tuned differently, which means their frequency response is different, which is why a one-size-fits-all thing, which can sometimes work, doesn't always work. So now what I like to do is I like to bring down kind of the middle of the tone. So look at this guy. The middle is between the fundamental tone and then the higher tone. So I like to bring down the middle and then bring up kind of the higher-ish. You might actually look at these and you might think, well, they do actually look kind of similar in terms of each individual EQ. But in the past, the whole reason why I've done this is because in the past, like Superior Drummer's toms, I want them to really poke through. And in metal mixing, toms are treated like mixing-wise, essentially as being like tiny kick drums. And they're often used that way, too, by the drummers. They use them in the particular kind of fills or particular kind of uses that make them feel very much like just continued kick rolling, which is a lot easier than actually kick rolling. So that's part of their use in the metal mixing world. And so this is kind of how you treat kick drums. You have a lot of low frequencies and a lot of high frequencies. And then that's sort of how this works out. But the reason why you want that is because you want them to also have as much presence as kick drums for most uses. And it's hard to do with a one-size-fits-all on all of them because some of them are going to be the frequencies that are not really going to be in the right places and that kind of thing. And I wanted to have no chance of that in this. So that I made damn sure for all of the toms that I chose that they were going to be properly put together. And such. After that, we have the overheads and such. Now these guys, the way that I tend to treat them is that I bring down sort of the high mids, and then I bring up some higher frequencies, and I bring down the lower frequencies a lot. I didn't really need to do that this time around because there was no kick or snare activity in there to deal with, but most of the time I do. And in this particular case, I have a EQ up here and I have an EQ down here. And this is evidence of me being lazy because I came in here and I was like, I need to make a quick change, and I didn't want to be delicate about it. So that's why there's two of these kinds of EQs happening. Now, like I said before, the choices that I make were not super deliberate, and it was mostly sort of individual things I just kind of threw around layers. The point of having the ambient mics is that you use them to make the kit sound bigger, or you get rid of them to make the kit sound tighter. And this is a combination of both, where the kit is very, very tight sounding because of the lower, the kick and the snares direct mics, which is what these are just intense. But I also wanted that kind of, like, especially on the snare, that reverb that comes from the chamber mic. So like I wanted the air, but I also wanted the tightness. So that's just the comparison and the combination that I shot for. And then I put it all together in a Maximus on a bus. And now the splits that I usually make here represent the kick, snare, and everything else. And that's what I did. These, however, are mostly just kind of leveling and limiting and keeping it. Also, it's doing the stereo spreading with these guys. And then the master here, I do have it limited at plus 3 dB, and I also have sound saturation on 0 dB. So this is a little bit of a combination of both worlds, where the sound saturation is clipping it at 0 dB, but then also at plus 3 dB, the limiting is bringing it down a bit. So it's like calibrated to not do either too extremely. And I also have pretty long release time on the top here, and that's again because of that bigness and swelling type. I didn't really want it to be too fast. I wanted to kind of like pushing down like slowly that happens on the very fast, very transient loudness of the kick in the snare, because also all the cymbals and stuff are very quiet. You can see here that like the kick and the snare peak ridiculously high. Everything else kind of sits around minus 12 dB coming out of it, and like that's the kind of relationship I want to have. And the reason for that is because higher frequencies require less power to sound as loud as lower frequencies, which means they don't need to be as loud, like level-wise, for it to sound like it's there. And mixing-wise, this is great because this means that I can have a ridiculous amount of headroom and not really have to worry about damaging higher frequency stuff. Plus, I leave a lot of room for the lower frequency stuff, the louder and more important things to just be super-duper loud. As far as leveling the drums bus, my usual instinct is to keep the drums peaking generally louder than everything else. I don't actually have like a measurement for all the rest of the stuff, but I just kind of pushed it up there until I thought it sounded nice. And it happened to be kind of high in terms of its output. I have an EQ, which is doing almost nothing, and then I have a Maximus, which is doing everything. So in here, the split is the same, kick, snare, everything else. Not quite the same in terms of where the hats and the middle splits. That's because I have to contend with the other instruments as well, which have their own special positions to worry about. The lower frequencies had a bit of a fun day because remember the separate sub point. The whole point of doing separate sub stuff is the idea that you have only one thing happening in the bass along with the kick. In the case of this, however, I didn't do that, and so that means that we have a lot of real interesting behavior. However, this is pretty normal for metal, and metal is a genre where bass is not, a sub bass anyway, is not as prevalent. In fact, if you just play a bass guitar and you look at the frequencies that show up and are accentuated enough, the sub frequency of the note that you're playing is not as clear as the second and third harmonics. So this means that the sub is not very present, but like low mid bass definitely is, and so that's kind of what we're mixing for. Not only that, but the only thing that's actually creating sub bass in this track is that Reese sound. And the sub harmonic, the sub actual tone in there, is actually an entire octave higher than the actual bass level of this track. Which hilariously means that its sub-frequency is right in line with the part of the bass frequencies that are actually accentuated, which was a total accident, but that's why it works. Mids, a little bit of push, plus some openness so that the picking isn't really being controlled that much, but it's also really not, you know, mostly for the snare to kind of do its own thing. Higher frequencies are pushed as well. Up here, I'm kind of keeping it down on the time frequency on the time variables because I'm done. I've already made my character changes to release and decay and that kind of stuff with the other compressors. At this point, the mastering is all about keeping it level and limited, but doing so in as clear a way as possible, which usually means fast, so that it's not as noticeable that it's being compressed beyond the fact that it's just loud as shit. Now, normally in my EDM stuff, we can look at the master and we can usually see a pretty diverse amount of dynamic range. But even before this got limited, there wasn't a lot of dynamic range. And so right now we're pushing just about everything right up to the limit and being crushed right up there with the soft saturation. And the reason why it doesn't matter, the reason why this doesn't sound like shit right now, is because everything in this track is either distorted or so fast and transient that it doesn't matter. And it's a metal track, so that's just kind of all of it. That's literally everything. And if I had metal vocals in here, it still wouldn't matter because the vocals themselves are distorted in their own way. So that's why this kind of stuff works. And that's pretty much it for this track. Pretty much it with this track. That worked out pretty good. So I'll take this time to mention something interesting. Recently, YouTube allowed analytics to distinguish between people who are viewing your channel that are subscribed to your channel and people who are viewing your channel that are not subscribed to your channel. Turns out just about half of my views are from people who are not subscribed to my channel. So that means statistically, half of you watching this right now are not subscribed to my YouTube channel, which is fine. Honestly, it's okay. I get the views, and that's all right. Like at the end of the day, that's pretty much what matters. However, I'm thinking about starting being that guy on YouTube that at the end of the video goes, and don't forget to like and favorite and subscribe and comment and that whatever. And like, I just kind of want to see what that does to stats for a while. So that means I have to amend my ending, which is usually, if you have any questions about this, let me know. And as usual, have a nice day. So that means I'm going to have to say something like, please like, favorite, and subscribe. And if you have any questions about this, let me know. And as usual, have a nice day. Yeah, that works out pretty okay. So remember to like, favorite, and subscribe. And as usual, remember to like, favorite, and subscribe. If you have any questions about this, let me know. And as usual, have a nice day. There we go. I think I nailed it. I'm going to forget to do that again. I know it.